Hi, I'm Megan Baker. This is InfluenceHER. October is National Domestic Violence Awareness Month. On InfluenceHER, we are committed to raising public awareness on this pervasive issue and sharing powerful stories from inspiring women. It is our mission to uplift and unite women and fight against all forms of abuse, including physical, emotional, mental, verbal, and financial. We are pleased to welcome Nicole Molinero as our guest this month. Nicole is the president and CEO of the Women's Center and Shelter of Greater Pittsburgh. The nonprofit assists more than 7,500 adult and child domestic abuse survivors every year with emergency shelter, legal and medical advocacy, support groups, and more. Welcome, Nicole, and thank you so much for the support and the impact that you have on our local communities. Domestic violence affects 1 out of 4 women. Those are alarming statistics. If you're watching this, chances are you might know someone who is being abused and not realize it. What are some signs to look for, Nicole?
Right. Megan, that's a great question because there really are so many signs that folks can look out for. So, when we answer this question, it's important to keep in mind that relationships exist along a spectrum, right? There are healthy relationships, there are unhealthy relationships, and then there are abusive relationships. So, to look for an abuser, to look for somebody who uses abuse in a relationship, we have to first of all keep in mind that abusers use abuse because it works. That's really important to remember that this is an intentional pattern of power and control that's used within a relationship to kind of keep the other person off balance, to reduce their self-esteem, to really get what the abuser wants out of a relationship. So that intentionality really needs to be kept in mind. So what do we look out for specifically? Well, we oftentimes look out for folks who have big mood swings. So we call that Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, somebody who might behave one way in person, or one way in private, I should say, and another way in public. We look for somebody who gets angry at the drop of a hat, just angry very quickly. We look for folks who use control. I mean, that's a big part of this, is somebody who uses control within a relationship, and oftentimes who tries to isolate you. So somebody who, it might start off at first as showering attention upon you and wanting to spend all your time together, but then it ends up with them not wanting for you to hang out with your siblings or hang out with your family or hang out with your friends, and really just have you all to themselves. We also look for instance, somebody who just isn't nice a lot of times, might use hurtful jokes against you, who makes you seem that everything is your fault, who might make you apologize for everything, who has kind of another sense of reality that might not actually be based in reality. And of course, somebody who we see this happen oftentimes, somebody who uses gaslighting. So, what that means is making you believe that something happened or something happened one way when it actually happened another way. So, trying to convince you of something that's just not in line with reality. So, again, there's lots of different signs to look out for. It's difficult because, especially at the beginning of a relationship, folks put forth their best foot, and that's very natural in a relationship. But what we find is, in a healthy relationship, you might be putting forth your best foot, but you're still the same person. When somebody is abusive, they're putting forth a whole other person, really, that they aren't actually. So it's difficult at first, but if you can look out for the signs, it can be helpful.
Social media can really distort reality and make things appear as if they are picture perfect. How is this portrayal dangerous for domestic violence survivors, and are abusers taking advantage of it to hide what's really happening behind closed doors?
Right. So I think we know that what is happening in public is oftentimes not what's actually the real picture of what's happening behind closed doors. And that's probably in some cases the case for every family, right? But for where situations where they're abusive, it's a dramatic difference. So that can be dangerous because on social media, for instance, or just in real life, we see people who we think are in a happy, healthy relationship, who are strong, perhaps, who don't need any sort of help. You can be very strong, but still need help within a relationship. And so a portrayal on social media that everything is just wonderful and nobody's in need of any sort of support and help can be dangerous for survivors, because then they really start to feel like they have no one to reach out for, because there's a persona that you want to really kind of perpetuate. And abusers can use that very much so in saying, this is our life. Why would you doubt this? What she's saying isn't true. And so it makes it very hard for victims to be believed whenever what is being presented in public is different than what's happening behind closed doors.
One personality disorder that is commonly linked to domestic violence is narcissistic personality disorder. Why is this?
Right. So it's important to preface this by saying that abuse, using battering, is not a mental health problem. It is something that is learned, and it is used because it works. And so that's really important to put out there. However, about half or so of those who use abuse do also have some sort of mental health diagnosis, and that could be narcissistic personality disorder, it might be depression, might be post-traumatic stress disorder. It just really depends on that individual person. But narcissistic personality is very much linked to abusers, those who use domestic violence, because they really present one way. Again, kind of going back to the answer about what things look like in private versus in public. Those who have narcissistic personality disorder really behave keeping in mind their own self-interest, what is good for them, what everybody else thinks of them. So it's really based in a lot of self-esteem issues. But what is presented to the world is somebody who, is a grandiose idea of themselves. Somebody who is perfect. Somebody who, has a perfect life. And so that very much can play into somebody who uses control and power against somebody else within a relationship.
Nicole, it's important to stress that domestic violence is not always physical. Can you explain
Yes.
what other forms, as we mentioned in the introduction, of domestic abuse exist and how they can leave women feeling just as powerless or trapped?
Right, absolutely. So we hear of physical abuse happening because we see it mostly. That's what everybody thinks of first and foremost when they think of domestic violence. And certainly, physical abuse can have lasting effects physically and emotionally. But what we hear really across the board from survivors who have been physically abused is that typically the emotional abuse, the psychological abuse, all of the other types of abuse are actually worse and have worse repercussions. So we know that there is emotional abuse, there is psychological abuse, there is financial abuse, there's child abuse, so using children, there is using privilege, there are all sorts of different types of abuse that people can be experiencing. And if you are, and of course, sexual abuse, which I didn't mention, but is very, very prevalent. Um, so all of these different types of abuse may be used, or there may be one or a few different types of abuse, but they all really are following that intentional pattern of power and control that one person in a relationship is using against the other. And it can really make somebody feel powerless if their self-esteem has been degraded over time. It can make them feel helpless if their safety is threatened, because isolation, threats, very specific threats around how they're going to kill the other person. These can all make somebody feel very unsafe, can make them feel very insecure and unsure of themselves, and make them think really that they can't get help, when we know that, of course, help and hope is available for everybody, regardless of what's going on in the relationship.
Nicole, I'm one who typically sees good in everyone. And there have been times where you possibly ignore those red flags or the bad behavior. So, what advice can you give to women who want to believe that their abusive partner can change?
Megan, I'm the same way. I see the good in everybody as well. And, I will say that if somebody really wants to change and is getting support, preferably through a batterers intervention program, it could be an individual therapist who really understands the dynamics of battering. It is possible for somebody to change, but again, they have to want to do that on their own. So if you're in an abusive relationship, and you want for your partner to change, but your partner doesn't see the need for it, or you believe they're giving lip service to the need to change, or you see them going to therapy or going to another intervention and their behavior actually not changing, that's when to really start to think, okay, they don't want to change. And if they don't want to change, just like any other issue, if whether it's weight loss, whether it's smoking, any of these issues, if you don't want to change or don't feel the true need to change, change isn't going to happen. So that's when it's important to really very honestly look at the relationship and say, this is not acceptable behavior in a healthy, loving relationship.
Another really important aspect of the impact of domestic violence and abuse are the effects on our children. What advice do
Right.
you have for mothers who are survivors and feel responsible or guilty for what their children witnessed and then leaving a domestic abuse situation?
Right. So I'll start with saying that there is help and hope for children too. There are lots of programs for children to help them to recover from the abuse that they witnessed or that they knew happened in their house. And there's help if the abuse is ongoing, or there's help if the abuse is in the past. And at any age, kids can get help. So let me start by saying that. Because the truth of the matter is, if you have grown up in a household where there is domestic violence of any type, you've really learned that behavior pattern. And oftentimes, you will go one of two ways. No, it's not inevitable, of course, but you'll go one of two ways: either using that abuse and power and control over someone else in a relationship in the future, or becoming a victim or survivor in a relationship. So you definitely have more of a chance of going one of those two ways if you've been raised in an unhealthy and abusive environment. Now, with that said, it depends on, there's lots of variables, right? It depends on whether the abuse was talked about, which we always encourage families, moms or whoever's not being abused in the relationship, I should say, to talk with the children and say, this is not acceptable behavior. This sharing as much as they can in an age appropriate manner to let them know that it's not okay how they're being treated. Because if it doesn't get talked about, which it oftentimes doesn't, because parents typically think that kids don't really know what's going on, kids absolutely know what's going on. Oftentimes, they not only know what's going on, but they have even much worse ideas of what's going on than might even be happening. So, talking about it safely, for sure, safely with the kids and in an age appropriate manner, and getting them help once you're out of the relationship, or if you're trying to leave an abusive relationship and it's taking a while, trying to get them help can be incredibly useful in trying to end that cycle of violence, because otherwise the cycle of violence will very likely just repeat itself.
Nicole, what resources are available, perhaps through the center, that can help women in preparing to leave an abusive relationship?
So there are so many different resources available through not only Women's Center and Shelter of Greater Pittsburgh, but really any domestic violence program in any community across the country, really. So all domestic violence programs have 24-hour hotlines that you can call for safety planning, emotional support, resources, information, referrals, and connections really into that program services. Most programs, not all, but most programs have emergency shelters. That's for folks who are in immediate lethal danger. We find at Women's Center and Shelter only about 4% of our clients actually need shelter. So only about 400 or so a year. The remaining, 7,000 plus need any of our other services. So that includes legal advocacy. That includes our immediate needs program, helping to meet concrete needs and addition ongoing safety, complex safety planning needs. That can mean our medical advocacy program, our support groups, our individual therapy appointments for both adults and children. And we have all sorts of other different specialty programs, specifically at Women's Center and Shelter, that try to meet the needs of refugees, immigrants, and limited English speakers, of the LGBTQ plus community, of folks who are experiencing both intimate partner violence or domestic violence and child abuse. So we have all of these different programs at Women's Center and Shelter. We also run one of our county approved battering intervention programs, obviously not an on-site program, but a program that goes for 24 weeks to help those who use power and control in a relationship, whether they're sent by the courts because they have violated the law, or whether they are interested in changing their behavior and want to volunteer to come on their own. So we have, myriad of services at Women's Center and Shelter. But the bottom line, whatever your need is, if you're in an abusive relationship, whatever your goal is, whether the goal is to leave or whether the goal is to stay safely in the relationship until you're able to leave, but whatever your goal is, we are here to help to offer you help, hope, and concrete action to really empower you to make the decisions that are best for you and your kids.
Nicole Molinero, it has been a pleasure speaking with you. We appreciate your time to talk about this very important issue that plagues far too many women. Thank you for all you do in the community and the work that you do on behalf of Women's Center and Shelter for Greater Pittsburgh.
Megan, thank you so much for having me on here. We really appreciate your assistance.